Welcome to True Crime Cases, 2006 in Redford, a tiny town situated in Michigan, and life continued as typical with a population of somewhat more than with 31,000 residents. This city served as on the main. Everyone knew one another. There were historic structures on the street that had endured throughout several generations, and in St. Paul's stood in the heart of the city. Church where locals congregated each Sunday to talk about the most recent news and make friends with 55-year-old Carol Winters. Harper Redford has had a widow from the beginning of time. Her home was old and comfortable. Near the city's edge, adjacent to the Harper from the jungle, has always been an esteemed community member, even following the passing of her spouse, sadly, 5 years ago, in an accident. She seldom ever left the city, and she always devoted her time to gardening at home and reading. She is known for being a lady who is aware of everyone's secrets inhabitants, yet is never rushing to tell them about Redford's inhabitants. In the shadow of an unresolved past, let go of incident reports, hearsay, and secrets that were verbally transmitted to mouth, produced a tense environment. As though a shadowy object were looming above the city, and this depressing mood became more intense. During one August 2007 day, something horrible happened that startled all of Jackson City. Jackson, a young man 19, was discovered dead on the tree's edge. Not far from his remains were found in Harper's houses by a person walking his dog in the street. His death circumstances were Jackson's corpse lay in an odd and scary position among the dense, leaf-covered bush and branches, as though an individual had purposefully attempted to conceal it. There were indications of neck strangulation, and his arms were sliced as though he was attempting to protect himself. When Jacob got there, he knew right away that this case would be beyond the parameters of a typical the city of Redford's inquiry, as such atrocities were uncommon, and Jacob was a male, having moral integrity, who consistently made an effort to keep his city in order. But this murder was an unusual occurrence that Jacob contacted, and he had to deal with Carter, detective seeking Detective Carter assistance, whoever he had worked with in the past. Carter, along in the Detroit police, was a skilled investigator with of resolving the most challenging situations. When he got to Redford, he started his inquiry by looking into the offense scene and speaking with witnesses immediately. Focus was brought to the Harper home, which was about a couple hundred meters away from the location where the corpse was discovered. Carter saw it a way that the city keeps its own existence private from outsiders. He sensed the gaze behind the residents' smiles were gloomy. Secrets that could provide insight into Jackson's. The first action he took was murder. Was questioned by many who knew Jackson closest to him, as well as those who could have seen him. Meanwhile, in the last hours of his life, rumors started to circulate in the city at amazing speeds in cafes, while using gas stations at shops all around the world, where they discussed solely Jackson's passing. Some others said they saw Jackson the previous evening with an unidentified woman. Others believed he had a hand in something risky. But one thing was evident, that Jackson's passing had everyone in Redford as tense. At examining their Harper's shoulders after learning about Jackson's passing, was unable to find a home for herself. Having known him since recollections of childhood as a little boy playing with other people in the street kids, it seemed amazing to her that he could be handled so crudely by someone. However, she secretly believed that this event would mark the start of the end of her peaceful existence in Redford. Detective Carter collected all the information he could, knowledge, and ready for the next phase of he had to do an inquiry to determine which among the inhabitants of this apparently serene town could have anything to do with the killing. With every new questioning and every new fact that he grew increasingly persuaded that there was something sinister concealed in Redford, whom everyone was aware of, but was quiet. Therefore, an inquiry was started. The event would permanently alter Redford's life. Jackson's corpse was discovered the day after discovered that Redford was submerged into a fearful and anxious mood. It appeared like the air itself had get heavier, and the quiet, typically so soothing, now crushed on the ears, as though everyone is anticipating something awful. Was discussing Jackson's homicide, and everyone was attempting to do more than just comprehend what was being placed, but also to shield their family from potential Jacob. Jacob is at jeopardy because he, one of the few individuals born and brought up in Redford, was well familiar with all of the residents and was aware of their customs and conduct, but now he had to examine them individuals in various ways with distrust. He completely believed that one of his neighbors could kill someone, which infuriated him, and Carter, a desperate detective, investigated the murder site in the interim using expert care in the forested region where the corpse was found to be a complicated network of routes that go to various, in some areas of the city. The location was known restricted to people who have previously resided in Redford, enough to become familiar with all of its nooks and crannies. Closely inspecting the earth, Carter observed indications of a struggle. Dents in the ground and damaged branches, droplets of blood, all of which indicated the fact that the murder had taken place in this forest. An analysis of Jackson's body verified the first fears that he was strangled. There were profound scars left by a cable or rope on his neck and several scrapes and bruises on his face and arms, suggesting that he had attempted to protect himself from the detective saw it away, that this was not a haphazard killing, rather, it was one of Ree's intentional and vicious crimes. The first step was to determine the precise. The medical examiner at the time of death concluded that Jackson passed away at midnight. Reducing the number of suspects to concentrate on those seen close to the location of the crime during that period, especially in a little community where everybody knowing one another, identifying suspects was difficult. Most inhabitants just did not think that anybody they knew was capable of take action in the first person. Carter Harper was asked if she was her the residence was too near the scene of the crime. That this is just a coincidence, despite Harper's horror at the notification of Jackson's passing. The investigator observed anything odd about her. Her demeanor was overly composed and somewhat aloof. It can be a sign of shock or something. Carter knew he was even more covert, could not immediately draw conclusions. Thus, he persisted in asking her about what she may have heard or seen. Harper stated that she spent the evening at I went to bed early and saw nothing suspicious, but her responses were also general, as though she was trying to dodge talking about a significant topic. The examination, additionally, the detective focused on other locals who may have information. Harper's Margaret Maggie Winters, the day the daughter came in Redford following Jackson's passing. She was worried that her mom may be engaged in this issue, but lacked the courage to. Maggie realized that in order to publicly suspect her, Jackson and her mother spoke, but didn't think this message could have such a terrible ending. Carter as well shifted his focus to Bobby Smith. A local person was said to be aware Bobby encountered legal issues in the past and frequently got into altercations, putting him among the potential figures. He lived alone, capable of committing such a crime near the city's outskirts, and left a remote way of life that made him conduct that is much more dubious. While the detective gathered information and created a sequence of events, the city persisted and people avoided the streets out of dread, shutting their doors in the nights and windows in the hopes that the murderer will be discovered as quickly as possible. Carter was aware, so he had to gather every component of this complex problem as soon as feasible to bring justice back and provide tranquility to this little but profound Carter. The rattled city detective immersed himself in the inquiry, understanding how serious the problem is despite his stellar career, in which he having to cope with a broad range of crimes. This instance was notable for its the little village is gloomy and uncertain. Of Redford appeared to be the final location where one would anticipate such a terrible crime. But the evidence showed Carter had to figure out the opposite to determine whether locals may choose to murder the young man first. Days of the inquiry shown the city is very challenging. The community was taken aback by the events, and nobody was in a rush to open. Despite this, they opened their doors to the cops. Carter conducted thorough interviews with everyone who could have any connection to First. Jackson dated Harper. Winter's close neighbors include people who lived close to the body's location, discovered the old forest, which turned into the everyone was familiar with the crime site. It was for all Redford inhabitants seen as secure, and plenty of kids played and grown-ups frequently went for picnics there, or simply for strolls. Although the woodland now had turned into a terror icon, and nobody wished to recall that it had previously been one of the city's favorite spots, Carter made the decision to begin with Harper Winters, despite the fact that she denied any involvement and said that she observed nothing unusual happen to her that evening. Conduct was still questioned. The detective believed she was hiding something. Something he asked her to participate in, questioned by the local police once more. Station, eager for further collaboration on Carter's involvement in the interrogation, maintained a close watch on Harper. Examining each of her movements and pauses in between sentences, she acted with dignity. However, the investigator believed that behind this there was a profound inward serenity on the outside. Harper claimed to be aware of the disagreement. Jackson has frequently visited since he was a toddler, visited her home and assisted with household chores. However, there was no intimacy or romance bond between them. In spite of her guarantees, Carter was powerless to believe that something was amiss in the interim. Jacob persisted and speak with other city dwellers. He was not as skilled an investigator as Carter, but his familiarity with the local Jacob proved to be a useful resource. Was able to gather several rumors, some hypotheses that could provide insight into what was going on. He discovered that Jackson was more complicated than he appeared to be. Initially, his actions appeared to have recently altered a lot recently, and he frequently remained late, ignored former acquaintances, and even started dating individuals with a questionable. Bobby was one of those individuals with a reputation. Jacob remembered Bobby's behavior. Repeatedly apprehended by the police for altercations and minor offenses, yet each time he escaped severe punishment. Smith had been behaving recently especially oddly. He showed up in town less frequently, avoided getting together with pals. She appeared to be anxious all the time about anything. Jacob chose to take this individual as under particular supervision and agreed with Carter to question him in the foreseeable future. Margaret Harper's daughter, Maggie Winters, who arrived in Redford and discovered herself under detective's examination. Despite her, the conduct wasn't really suspicious. She was the only close relative Carolyn had. Furthermore, Carter wanted to ensure that she having no hidden agenda. Maggie stated she was aware of her mother's relationship with Jackson, but didn't think about it. She voiced alarm about anything out of the ordinary on her mother's health and the likelihood that she may become entangled in this instance, but demanded that her mom could not have killed someone regardless. Carter persisted and gathered data in an effort to avoid missing. He looked at every information on Jackson's phone, documents to determine his identity. Speaking with during the latter days of one of the final calls of his life was a talking with an unidentified number. This was done for a number of minutes. Just before he passed away, it was discovered that this number was registered to Bobby Smith, which only made suspicions directed at him. The detective made the decision to search Smith's house, looking for any proof that would connect him. The search was conducted in relation to the homicide. With the court's approval yielded findings, a rope was discovered in Bobby's garage that was available for strangle. Jackson's blood matching traces. Blood from the victim was discovered on the rope, was the first substantial component of proof that connected Bobby Smith to the criminal. Bobby was taken into custody right away, and Carter was brought to the police station, prepared to be questioned since he knew he had much proof. But Bobby didn't intend to give up easy. Denied any participation and asserted that the rope had been in his possession for a while, and the blood on it may have been visible by accident. But Carter saw that this wasn't a coincidence. Therefore, they chose to apply pressure to the suspect so that get the truth from him simultaneously. Period. The city remained terrified. People were talking about who may come next, because if a murderer was at large, nobody was safe at the time. But the arrest, Bobby Smith's presence, soothed the locals but many people continued to question his guilt. Detective and Jacob Carter was aware that the case was not at all over, and they were required to display every card to demonstrate the suspect's guilt or discover the real murderer. If Bobby turned out to be Bobby Smith's arrest for being innocent was a significant shift in the Redford. Locals started an inquiry to wish that the case would be quickly resolved, and the offenders would get the penalty they were due. Carter, a detective, was in. He realized there was no rush to wrap up the case. Every crime necessitates a thorough analysis of all the specifics, and even though the proof discovered that Bobby Smith was the source of most of the Bobby Smith's tale was still unknown. Despite police pressure, obstinately disputed his culpability. He asserted the bloodstained rope was, in fact, his. However, he was unable to clarify how Bobby's footprints from Jackson ended up on it. Maintained that he was by himself at home on the evening of the murder, which naturally Detective Carter could not be confirmed. Paying close attention to his testimony, couldn't get rid of the impression that Smith either concealed something or didn't actually the murderer. But Jacob carried on with the interview. Redford locals are attempting to congregate as much information as you can about Jackson and his associates. Over these discussions, fresh information started to appear that would provide insight into the reasons behind the murder. As it proved out, Jackson wasn't the youthful, carefree man who many people thought was there in recent years. Conduct has altered significantly. Months, he frequently got more reticent, absent at night, and behaving as though he was concealing something significant. Discovered Harper actions particularly dubious in light of Bobby. After Smith was arrested, she ceased to leave the houses, didn't speak to neighbors, and declined to participate in interviews to local reporters, who naturally aimed to create a buzz around this case. Rumors started to spread in the city in which Harper may be active. Others even conjectured that she committed this atrocity, was the one who encouraged Bobby to murder, maybe by extorting him or controlling his emotions. Carter discovered Harper's behavior, chose to question her once again, realized that without her testimony, the image of the crime was still there. The detective was aware that it was not full. Jackson and Harper were romantically involved. That was more than just friendship, but in spite of all the speculation, there was no proof that they had a bond that was more than this time. It's more than friendship. Harper was questioned more intense. Carter probed in an attempt to find any discrepancies in her. Harper stayed composed, but there she continued to deny the tightness in her gaze, participation in the homicide, and maintained that she had no knowledge of what took place that evening. But the investigator saw that Harper stayed away from responding directly to a few inquiries that only heightened his doubts in the interim. Forensic specialists kept researching the evidence, discovered a blood test on the rope attested to its ownership. Jackson transforming Bobby Smith into the primary suspect, but no more evidence were discovered at the rope or on the site of the crime that could reveal Smith's existence in the woodland during the period of. Carter was worried by the murder, since the absence of more evidence indicated that someone could have purposefully framed Detective Bobby as well. Asked for Jackson's phone to be examined. Records from the last few weeks' analysis of the calls turned up a number of additional fascinating information. Jackson often reached out to a man named George Evans, who had not before been mentioned. George had recently moved to Redford. Only a year after moving to the area, he stayed to himself and didn't interact much with locals, which made him. Carter is even more suspect. Choose to question George Evans. After meeting the detective right away, Evans saw his uneasiness and attempted to be kind and forthright, yet his actions revealed tension, which he said he was aware of Jackson just on the surface and spoke with him exclusively about business issues. But when Carter started to inquiries concerning the murderous night, Evans' testimony grew muddled, which only made the detective. George Evans had no alibi for accusations of. He said that on the night of the murder, he was alone himself at home. So at Carter, it's hard to confirm his assertions. Saw that Evans looked away from him as regarding his connection with Jackson. Every minute of the questioning it more clear that Evans was concealing something. But what was it? Continued to be a mystery. Alongside the Carter started researching interrogations. Jackson's history. If it that Jackson passed away not long before, borrowed a substantial amount of cash from one of the nearby moneylenders. This information gave the research a new dimension. Once it was evident that Jackson may be engaged in some dubious activities pertaining to illicit activity, Carter started creating a revised version of what occurred. Maybe Jackson became entangled in anything risky that eventually resulted in until his passing. Yet the query persisted, did Harper have any role in these? Could she be the connection between Jackson and whomever made the decision to eliminate? The detective made the decision to go back to examining the data in the hopes of discovering something that might support or contradict. He realized from his estimations that the amount of investigation was increasing. Daily challenges, but he was certain that the truth will surface sooner or meanwhile. In Redford, Panic was expanding. Inhabitants started to understand that the murderer remained at large, and someone from their surroundings could be people who were involved in this crime at the time tried not to go outside after dark. Shutting doors and windows in an attempt to defend themselves against an unseen danger to the hitherto tranquil and serene city was becoming a location where Carter distrusted everyone, knowing he had to take prompt action to stop further increase in mistrust and concern that he was getting ready for a fresh round of research that could result in discover this deep and complicated tale. The inquiry went on, and the strain on Carter, a detective, became increasingly acute with each fresh questioning. With every new discovery, he sensed the noose getting tighter. Near one of the suspects, however, who the killer's identity was kept a secret. After a period of intrigue, the city of Redford had been waiting for the denouement. Hope the truth was close to be disclosed. Carter thoroughly examined every piece of evidence discovered in an attempt to assembling the disparate fragments of one of the main pieces of evidence is the puzzle discovered on Bobby Smith nearly demonstrated his participation. Yet something troubled that there were too many details, detective. That was not part of the whole picture. Jackson's blood-containing rope was discovered, seemed to be framed in Smith's garage. Evidence: the investigator believed that someone was making a conscious effort to divert the inquiry. In the interim, George Evans, whose actions during interrogation sparked suspicion, became the investigation's main focus. Carter made the decision to look further and learn more about the detective's past, contacted his connections in other cities to get an Evans file. The results were obtained quickly. As it happened, George Evans was engaged in a number of illegal schemes prior to relocating to Redford, yet he consistently got away with it this time. Revelation simply made Carter stronger. Suspicions: the investigator chose to interview Evans once more, but this time, according to the data he had been given during the discussion, Carter started posing inquiries about Evans' history, implying his prior affairs. Evans was obviously anxious about his responses grew less certain, and his tries to steer clear of direct responses solely grew his suspicions. Carter once created in an attempt to shatter Evans. He stated that he was aware of his connections to the criminal underworld and his participation in further violent incidents. Evans, recognizing that his history had been shockingly exposed, altered his conduct. He made an effort to assure the investigator that his history instances were unrelated to Jackson's murder and that he was a victim himself of such situations. But Carter sensed much more than just what he said. As Carter applied pressure to Evans, Jacob persisted in developing a parallel course of inquiry. He decided to himself to determine Jackson's potential linked to the illegal conduct that Jacob had been mentioned by Carter in passing. Found that Jackson could have been engaged in illicit drug dealings. He started searching for links between Jackson, the neighborhood drug dealers, and it turns out their efforts quickly paid off. Jackson owed a substantial amount to one of the tiny merchants, who were then connected to George Evans. This new information significantly altered the throughout. The Carter and Jacob started their inquiry by providing a different account of what transpired. Jackson was now a part of Evans's illegal plans, and when he was unable to settle his obligations to hide his tracks, he was slain. Although, however, it was still unclear how Harper could all of this involves Winters. Harper was taken in by Detective Carter for asking again. He was resolved to obtain responses to queries that are still remained unresolved. During the dialogue, Carter asked her straight if she was aware of Jackson's affiliations with Evans, and his participation in Harper was obviously involved in illicit activity. Not anticipate this development, and she response indicated that she was more knowledgeable than she had previously said, that she acknowledged knowing that Jackson could encounter issues, but did not attach. Does it matter in light of him? Only youthful and irresponsible. Harper said Jackson saw her many times for advice, acknowledging his difficulties. However, she was unaware of how terrible it was. Her admission provided investigators with fresh leads regarding the reason for the murder. Although it yet unknown what part she played in, Carter started to examine the case. What he had discovered thus far, G. Evans ended up playing a key role in this convoluted tale of his crime links, were a part of unlawful exchanges, and had an incentive to get rid of Jackson, who had turned into an issue for him. But what role may Harper play in this tale? Carter made a decision this time. He asked Evans to take a chance, and Harper to a dispute in the hopes because their responses to one another's presence might yield fresh hints. Evans was obviously anxious during the encounter. Harper, however, seemed more certain as Carter started to inquiries. Their responses started to conflict with one another, and it quickly became evident that at some point one of them was lying. Evans couldn't take it any longer and tried to charge Harper with being the person who encouraged him to murder Jackson, allegedly using her to blackmail him awareness of his illicit activities. Everyone was taken aback by the announcement, including Carter, but Harper right away disputed these charges, stating that Evans attempted to place the blame on Carter, thought that in order to protect his own skin, he was about to disclose the entire truth, but he needed further proof that ordered further examination of all the evidence, such as the rope, to attempt to discover fresh leads that might provide insight into which one of them was the murderer. Jacob, meanwhile, carried on with his inquiries. He discovered a person who saw Jackson the night before he was killed, with an unidentified man who was close to look like Evans, and this proof was the last straw that made Reed draw final findings. Carter collected all the individuals involved in the study and declared that he had discovered the real murderer. Every piece of evidence gathered in the George Evans was identified as the someone who made the decision to fire Jackson to hide his illegal actions he took by using his relationship with Harper to enter Jackson's space, and then attempted to deceive Bobby Smith in order to Evans was taken into custody. Following an inquiry, and under duress from the evidence, he acknowledged his responsibility for Jackson's murder, shown to be a component of a cold and terrible crew plot to hide his identity and conceal his illegal actions. Carter was at last, the case may be closed, and returned tranquility to Redford City. With the George Evans' arrest in the city of Redford, was at last able to exhale a sigh of relief from Jackson's murder, and the ensuing inquiry astounded everyone. Locals. But now that the offender was captured, the town's vitality and started to progressively got back to normal. But the horror at what happened and their repercussions had a lasting impression on the people's hearts, were won over by George Evans, who was found guilty of Jackson's murder. In addition to his involvement in several other drug-related offenses, the trial was about extortion and trafficking. Quick, because the proof gathered by Evans was being overpowered by Detective Carter, acknowledged his guilt and did not reject it. More resistance was pointless, because he was given a life sentence without this tale about parole for Harper was very challenging in spite of the fact that she was directly involved in Jackson's, even if the murder was not confirmed. She felt the condemnation of the people in Redford started to stay away from her, and even people who used to be close to her should be wary of her gossip. In the aftermath, rumors persisted in spreading across the metropolis, and Harper became aware of her existence soon after. Things would never be the same here. She chose to sell at the trial's conclusion the home and relocated to a different city, with the intention of beginning a new life away from the past. Harper's, Maggie Winters, and Margaret daughter was likewise captivated by this horror. She went back to Redford to assist her mother, but following all the occurrences, she chose to remain with her exclusively. Maggie, till the passions died down, realized that her mother was not likely to in order to restore her prior place in society, and hence provided her assistance moving to and adjusting to a new Jacob. Jacob is there in spite of the case's completion proceeded, to concern that a horrible crime had took place in his city. He deliberated for a long time on how to avoid future disasters of this nature. Various methods for enhancing police work to react faster to possible dangers. Jacob acknowledged that some red flags could have gone unnoticed. Given the chance for the offender to do these, his mind was troubled. Therefore, he made the decision to meet with residents on a number of occasions to talk about safety precautions and enhance interactions between law enforcement and the community. With regards to Detective Carter, this case turned out to be one of the most challenging in his professional life, but also one of the most fulfilling part of solving the murder. Jackson needed more than just his professionalism, as well as his instincts focus on specifics and the capacity to comprehend the hidden motivations behind The seeming notwithstanding the successful completion of the Carter, believed that the experience had left a profound impression on him, and he realized that Redford and other small towns might conceal a lot more risks and secrets that, as one could anticipate, Reeve went back to his recognizing that his efforts in his hometown Redford had completed his work, but the ideas of how a single murder might alter the course of. He was not abandoned by a whole city, for he had known for a long time that he would recall this scenario for a while, and maybe this specific scenario would turn into instruction for him going forward. Even in the most serene settings, evil may lurk, ready to appear at any time. The city of Redford is now experiencing made it through this challenging period phase, started to gradually become better. People came back to their everyday existence, but the recollection of what transpired stayed with them. Jackson's murder was a remind them of the security, and their little town's tranquility is not as unbreakable as it was before appeared. But life continued, and the Redford locals did everything they could to improve their community more together and prepared to take on any obstacles. The warning indicators of unhealthy partnerships.